Hey, I'm Sarah. This is Thrills and Kills Booktube, where we talk about everything horror, thriller, and true crime. And today we are talking about cults. So previously I posted a video all about cults. So like, what are cults? How do people get involved in cults? Who gets involved in cults? How do they work? And then more information about like the field of study around cults and the study of the language that they use. So I will link that down below if you want to go check that out. But in today's video, I'm giving you all kinds of recommendations if you are also interested in cults like I am. So I've got recommendations for books, both fiction and nonfiction, about cults in general, about specific cults, some podcasts that I'm really obsessed with lately, and then some documentaries and docuseries on various streaming platforms. Some of these will be about cults in general, and then others will be about specific cults. Let's start with books. Let me tell you about a few fiction books that either have like cult-like vibes or are just outright plainly written about a cult. The first one I've got is Nat Cassidy's Mary. So there is a cult-like fringe obscure religion in here where they do follow a specific leader that is one of the tenets of a cult versus an organized religion. The focus is on a leader who has done bad things, but he has been venerated for doing those bad things. I don't want to tell you a lot more other than this was one of my favorite books in 2022. It was probably tied with my favorite book of the whole year. This is about female revenge. And it takes place in the American Southwest, like I said, with this fringe religion / cult. So the book is not necessarily about cults. It's just kind of like a fun little side piece to the book. But this is a fantastic, fantastic book. Next up, also cult-like vibes would be Camilla Sten's The Lost Village. So in this book, you're sort of questioning what happened. Now, there was a village that just the people up and disappeared. About 60 years ago, this village in Scandinavia of 900 people just poof, gone. And the police, it says on the back, the police searched every building, cottage, and villa, but they couldn't find a single soul. So in this book, there is a documentary filmmaking crew, and they are trying to go to this village and figure out what happened. And so throughout the book, you're sort of questioning at first, why did they just up and leave? Was this a cult type thing and maybe there was like a mass suicide that happened? Or is this some sort of supernatural paranormal thing that went on? Were they taken by UFOs? I mean, you name it, you're supposed to be questioning what happened. And this is very much written like a mix of like a horror and a like a Scandinavian true crime type novel. I actually read online somewhere where someone said this is like the Scandinavian version of like the Blair Witch Project in a way. It's just a very, very interesting book. I haven't read anything else kind of like this before. Next up, I actually haven't read this book yet, I'll be honest, Just Like Mother by Anne Heltzel. So this came in my Nightworm subscription a few months back. I do know this has two cousins who grew up in a cult and they are now adults. They've escaped the cult and they are reuniting. Now there's Maeve and there's Andrea. These are the two girls that escaped the cult and they have not seen each other since the night that they left, and they've kind of gone on to build new lives when suddenly the one pops up. Particularly Maeve, she's built a fantastic life for herself in New York City when suddenly Andrea pops up out of nowhere into her life again. Maeve is single, childless woman, and she's meeting all of Andrea's like rich friends, and they all seem to be very into like marrying, settling down, having babies. And the longer Maeve's spending time with Andrea and her rich friends up in the Catskills, the more it says like disconnected she feels from her life in New York City, and is starting to bring up some bad memories and traumatic experiences that she dealt with as a child in the cult. Anyone I know who's read this has had really great things to say about it. I've just got so many books, I haven't gotten around to it, not for any particular reason. Okay, so those are the ones that I own physically. The rest are on my Kindle. I'll have to put a little picture up here for you. The first one is Little Heaven by Nick Cutter. This also takes place in the American Southwest, and there are 3 main characters. There's this group called Micah, Minerva, and Ebenezer, and they are known to be sort of mercenaries. They're called the Englishmen. And this woman named Ellen hires them for the task of going down and checking in on her nephew, who she thinks might have been pulled into this group against his will, and she's worried about him. So they end up going down to New Mexico, and there is this group called Little Heaven that they've built up their little cult commune, and they are trying to check in on her nephew and kind of see what the heck's going on. Soon after they get there, though, it seems like it turns into pandemonium. All hell breaks loose. And the setting is supposed to be particularly eerie. I haven't read this one, but just looking at reviews, I guess like the geographical setting is really supposed to be quite eerie and scary. As the blurb says, paranoia and distrust soon group the settlement. Escape routes are gradually cut off as events spiral toward madness. That one sounds fantastic. Okay, and this last one, this is more of like a thriller, and this is called After the Fire by Will Hill. So the main character is named Moonbeam. So Moonbeam is a survivor of a cult, and this book is looking at her life from various perspectives in the cult, and then also her life after she has survived the cult. There was this big fire that happened, hence the name of the book, and that is what led to the escape and the rescue of the members of, let me get the name right, the Holy Church of the Lord's Legion was the name of the cult. We are following Moonbeam through her therapy sessions, and she's slowly revealing what she's been through, what happened in the cult. You're kind of almost like you're watching her reveal this in real time as she's going through therapy and learning to adjust to life outside the cult. Now, like many books about cults, there are some trigger warnings to check, especially around the abuse that women and children suffered at the hands of the cult leaders. What's interesting is I was reading some more about this book and in reviews that this was actually supposed to be inspired by the true events of the Branch Davidians and David Koresh down in Waco. So if you're an American, you might know about the siege on Waco and the Branch Davidians compound in the early 90s. Which there was a devastating fire and lots of people were lost. So again, just check trigger warnings before you go into this one, but this one again is called After the Fire. All right, let's move on to memoirs. Some of the most fascinating memoirs I've ever read are from people who have escaped either fringe extremist groups or outright cults. Many of these have extreme triggering descriptions, events, etc. So again, I would just recommend that you look up trigger warnings for any of these, especially the memoirs, especially because these are people who are true survivors, and something about telling that story from the first person perspective is just very jarring and hard to read. So especially this first one. I actually had to DNF this, not because it was bad, just it was too much for me to handle, but this was such an interesting book, I wanted to recommend it. Now this one is called Sex Cult Nun. This is by Faith Jones, and this is about her life and escape from the Children of God cult. This cult started in America in the 1960s by her grandfather and eventually moved outside of America, and there was a stronghold of this cult in Asia, in South Asia. And so she grew up with her family in extreme poverty, basically living in like squalid conditions in rundown shacks in Macau, which is sort of a territory, I guess, owned by the Portuguese, and it's attached to China. Now, this cult is specifically known for its severe crimes against children, about severe sexual abuse, which included children, the systematic abuse, and how parents would even partake, and saw nothing wrong with it. And that's about all I feel like I can really describe without getting like put on a watch list. This book was, I was actually listening to the audiobook, and I had to stop it at many times. It was just very, very hard to listen to what Faith went through, what her siblings went through, at the hands of their parents, even at the hands of adults that were like aunts and uncles or family friends, people that they felt that they could trust. I mean, mothers turning tricks with their Johns while their children are in the bed with them, or sitting next to the bed watching them. I mean, and that's like not even scratching the surface of how bad this was. So please, if you're going to read that one, just make sure you read about it first. I didn't do my due diligence and very quickly found out like I could not finish it, but that was a fantastic book. The next memoir I'm going to recommend, I actually listened to this on Audible a few years ago, The Sound of Gravel by Ruth Warner. So she grew up in a polygamist cult down in Mexico. And again, her grandfather, I think, was someone who founded this sect of the religion, which then became a full-blown cult. What's different about this cult is, so this was sort of a breakaway sect of the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, which itself is a cult and a breakaway from the mainstream Mormon religion. Now, what I find interesting about this is they actually, at one point, escaped to Mexico because they were practicing polygamy. And I think she was one of like 40-something siblings. Her father had 40-something children and multiple wives. And so they were all living in Mexico to escape capture from the authorities in America. And I guess the Mexican authorities kind of turned a blind eye and thought, you know what? They're bringing money into our community. They may be weird, but like, leave those gringos alone, basically, is how she explains it in the book. And so her father, I actually went back and looked it up again. Her father was the founder of the colony, and he is murdered at some point, and so their life drastically changes. Her uncle, the father's brother, becomes the new leader of the church, and her mother remarries, and the abuse just continues. Now, her mother is not technically the legal wife, or is not the legal wife of her new husband, so they have to go back and forth between America and Mexico, so she can go over to America as an American citizen and collect various forms of welfare to help them get along while they're living in Mexico. And it's while she's spending time over in the US during these trips that Ruth starts to begin to understand that her family is not normal, that they don't do things like most other families, and maybe what she's been taught to believe in is not true. So eventually she does get out of the cult, and it's just very interesting, and it was actually the first memoir I had read of someone who was a cult survivor. Next up, I've got Slonim Woods 9 by Daniel Barban-Levin. That's quite a name. I had to look it up. So if you have read The Last Housewife, which is a mystery thriller type of book, that is based on a real cult that happened at Sarah Lawrence College in New York State. So Slonim Woods 9 is the memoir, the firsthand account of one of the original housemates, members of that group. There was a group of college kids at Sarah Lawrence College living together in a house, and there was one member of the house who somehow convinced her roommates that she should move her middle-aged dad into the house. His name was Larry Ray, and just an odd character, like a con man. If you ever saw a con man in your life, like this, reading about him, you're like, oh wow, like look up the definition of con man in the dictionary and it's him. And somehow he was able to convince these very bright, educated, like somewhat wealthy, because Sarah Lawrence is a very expensive private college, able to convince these kids to defer to him to the point where they all start living together. He's living in their college dorm. Okay, this is not an apartment off campus. This is a college housing situation. He's living with them and starting to demand like when they eat, how they dress, how they act. He starts sleeping with some of the girls that live in the house. And they're all coming to him for like relationship advice, and he's telling them like, oh, maybe you should break up with this person. And then over the summers, they all move into a small apartment in New York City, and like this is continuing, and his influence over them is gaining and gaining. And eventually, he actually did face criminal charges for what went on. And again, if you've read The Last Housewife, a lot of what happened there is like a direct depiction from the true story that happened at Sarah Lawrence College. Very, very interesting. I won't say much more in case you don't know much about it, but you should go check it out. So Slonim Woods 9. All right, and then the last memoir I have, this is actually about someone who was in the Manson cult. So this is called Member of the Family, My Story of Charles Manson, Life Inside His Cult, and the Darkness That Ended the 60s by Diane Lake. So Diane actually spent a year with Charles Manson and his family, as he called it. She was actually the youngest member, and in this memoir she talks about how she met Charles, how she got involved in his cult, and what it was like living amongst his little family. What's interesting about her was she was 14 at the time, and her parents actually like wrote her a little permission slip saying she had their permission to go off and live with this grown-ass man and join his cult. Like, I'll never understand. Just never understand some things that parents do. Now, Diane says that she was never part of any of the criminal activity of the family, especially like the murders that they committed. Now, she was arrested with the group and she actually helped the prosecution's case, but like she was not charged or convicted like some of the other members of the group. So if you have an interest in Charles Manson, his family, and how he was able to convince them to commit murder in his name, then you might want to check out Member of the Family. All right, now let's talk about some other nonfiction books. So this first group, these are about cults in general. The first one, and I'm actually listening to it right now, is called Cultish by Amanda Montell. This is all about the language of fanaticism. So in the first half of the book, she really sets up how the language of cults work, why they choose to use specific language, what is that doing to your brain, like psychologically, how is using very specific language and techniques able to get you to join a cult. She does talk about some specific cults in there. Interesting, her father grew up in the cult Synanon, and then he escaped as a young man. So she does reflect a lot on like her father and what he went through and accounts of his experiences living in a cult. And then later in the book, she talks more about not outright cults, but where she sees cult-like language in things like SoulCycle or CrossFit, MLMs, that kind of a thing. She does say that, obviously they're not outright cult, but if you look at the language, they are using very similar techniques. And it does make sense. Let's say like CrossFit, right? They're using very specific acronyms and words, and they're trying to create a sense of family and belonging and connectedness. So of course there would be some sort of overlap between the language they would use and the language that a cult would use. It's fascinating. And then these next group of books, these are also about cults in general. I feel like you could just pick one to maybe understand a little bit more. But the first one is called Cults Inside Out: How People Get In and Can Get Out. And this is by Rick Alan Ross. So just like the title suggests, this is sort of talking about who is susceptible to joining cults, how it is they find themselves in a cult, and then is it possible to be able to get them out. It is very, very difficult, but it is not impossible, clearly, or we wouldn't have memoirs of people who have escaped. The second one is called Cults: Inside the World's Most Notorious Groups. And this is by Max Cutler. He actually has his own podcast as well. And I think I'll be reading this book in April as part of the True Crime Book Club. I actually haven't read this yet, but since it was on there, I took a look and it sounded so interesting. So just to read you the little blurb: mystery, manipulation, and murder. Cults are associated with all of these, but what really goes on inside them? More specifically, what goes on inside the minds of cult leaders and the people who join them? Based on the hit podcast Cults, this is essential reading for any true crime fan. Cults is more than just a compilation of grisly biographies. In these pages, Max Cutler and national best-selling author Kevin Conley look closely at the lives of some of the most disreputable cult figures and tell the stories of their rise to power and fall from grace, sanity, and decency. I don't think they were ever decent. All right, and then this last book about cults in general, this is an older book, so it's written in the 80s. You might have some trouble finding it, but I thought this was very interesting. It's called Cults in America: Programmed for Paradise by Willa Apple. So when I was doing research for video part 1, I was finding that the majority of cults in the world are in America. So Americans are apparently especially susceptible to joining cults. It has to do something with like the history of how we were founded, and many people were trying to escape religious persecution. I don't know much about it. I do want to read this book. And again, it's supposed to touch on exactly why Americans are so susceptible and how did America become a breeding ground for cults. All right, now some nonfiction books about specific cults. This first one is about a Mexican drug cartel / cult. It's not quite clear to me yet, but this is called Buried Secrets: A True Story of Drug Running, Black Magic, and Human Sacrifice. Now this book was also a little bit hard to find because this was written in the 90s, and it's by Edward Humes. This describes the disappearance and brutal murder of a young American college student named Mark Kilroy in Matamoros, Mexico, and the bizarre drug-running cult responsible. So apparently there were a series of mass killings that happened in this town in the 80s. It says between 1985 and 88. Cult leader Adolfo Constanzo, who was Cuban-American, devoted to the Afro-Caribbean religion of Santeria, and his black magic offshoot, Palo Mayombe, set himself up as a magician and fortune teller in Mexico City in the mid-80s. He soon attracted disciples who obeyed him out of fear or love, and he saw that more money was to be made from drugs than reading cards. Oh boy. That one will be interesting to read. I haven't read it yet. Next up, we've got The Colony, Faith and Blood in a Promised Land, and this is by Sally Denton. So there are a variety of different polygamous sects that are still living in Mexico to this day. And if you remember, in 2019, there was actually a brutal killing of a caravan of moms and children who were driving back. I think they were coming back from America into Mexico to go back to their town, because the town was all people who lived in this cult together, and they were gunned down. Now, I was actually in Mexico when this happened. I was in Mexico City for Dia de Muertos, and it was like, I think maybe 2 days after Dia de Muertos, and I'm sitting in the hotel lobby at breakfast, and it came up on the screen, on the TV, that this had happened. So this book is about those events. On the morning of November 9th, 2019, an unassuming caravan of women and children were ambushed by masked gunmen on a desolate stretch of road in northern Mexico. The victims were members of the LeBaron and La Mora communities, fundamentalist Mormons whose forebears broke from the LDS Church and settled in Mexico when their religion outlawed polygamy. Produced international headlines for weeks and prompted U.S. president to threaten to send in the U.S. Army. In The Colony, best-selling investigative journalist Sally Denton picks up where the initial incomplete reporting on the attack ended and delves into the complex story of the LeBaron clan and their homestead, Colonia LeBaron. It's a portal into the past, a place that offers a glimpse of life within a polygamous community on an arid and dangerous frontier in the mid-1800s, though with smartphones and machine guns. Okay, next up I have, this is called Doomsday Mother by John Glatt. So this is actually about Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, and they are set to have their trial start in April. So I think I'm also going to be reading this with one of my book clubs. I've signed up for so many book clubs, I don't even remember. All I know is someone was reading this and I got this for like $4 on Book Outlet. I have not followed this very closely because I know the trial is going to be starting, and I kind of want to see like how the prosecution's case is going to unfold. I don't want to, not that I'm on the jury, but I don't want to go into it with my mind made up already. I kind of like to see how the American justice system plays out and how the prosecution and the defense make their case, which can be hard if you already go into it knowing all the details. But this is about this woman, Lori Vallow, and she met this man named Chad Daybell, who is sort of predicting like the end times. And I know that they thought people might have been zombies, and that when the God, what's that word? What's that? See, I'm not a Christian. What's that thing in the Bible? And then at the end of the Bible, and the trumpets, and the people are the rapture. When the rapture happens, apparently there was going to be certain people who were going to make it and like certain who wouldn't. There was a number. I don't know if they thought it was going to be like 50,000 people. Anyways, these two were out of their minds, and they thought they knew who was going to make it and who wouldn't. And they thought that her kids had become zombies, and then they had to murder them because it wasn't them anymore. So her 2 kids were killed, and so they're on trial for the murder of her children. And then they were found just like chilling out in Hawaii, like they had just gotten married, living their best life in Hawaii. And then the police are like, hey, no one's seen your kids in like 3 months. Where are your kids, Lori? And anyways, that's all I know. Can't wait to get into it. All right, the next one I have, this is called Broken Faith. I read this recently, actually in January. This I find so interesting because this is about a cult sort of near me. So this is about the Word of Faith Fellowship, which is in North Carolina, and this was started and is still being ran by this woman named Jane Whaley. They started out just as sort of like evangelicals with just really religious people who had a lot of devout faith, but it quickly turned sideways because they believe in this thing called blasting. So basically they believe that there are everyday demons that like are literally with us. So for example, if a child starts excelling in sports, and this is a real example from the book. If a child starts excelling at sports in school and is doing really good in soccer, but it's taking away his time from the cult, and therefore he's not available to be doing projects for free for the adults in the cult, then she would say that soccer demon has you, and we need to get that soccer demon out of you. And they would do this thing called blasting. They'd strap you into a chair, even children, even babies, and just start screaming at them, getting in their face and screaming at them to get this demon to leave them alone. And they're basically looking for you to like admit that yes, you've had this demon, and yes, you've been thinking these impure thoughts or what have you. And there are videos of this, but also the descriptions of it from multiple people who've been able to escape the group. And it's just really heartbreaking to listen to them having to sit through this for hours, like people around them getting in their face. And at some point, for people, it even escalated to violence, and they're getting punched in the chest, in the head, in the back, saying they can't breathe. And there's still like people in their face screaming at them. It's awful. But what's even worse is that this group has a lot of influence in its county and its local community, where people in the sheriff's office, local law enforcement, even like the DA's office are affiliated with this group. And so even though they've had multiple investigations from like Department of Social Services, nothing's ever happened to people. And it's really, really sad to read this book. Okay, and then I'm just going to recommend an author who writes about multiple different cults. So this is Jeff Gwynne. He is a fantastic nonfiction author, and he has books about Jonestown, about Charles Manson, and about the Branch Davidians. So he's got The Road to Jonestown, James Jones and the People's Temple, Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson, and Waco, David Koresh, The Branch Davidians, and A Legacy of Rage. Now, I have only read The Road to Jonestown. His approach to nonfiction writing, it's very approachable. You know, sometimes nonfiction can be really scary to people and turn them off, but it wasn't dry. I felt like it was very, very easy read. And I've seen a lot of good things. I've seen people post about him on Instagram, like that they've got all his books, so he's awesome. Okay, let's move on to podcasts. I don't know about you guys, but I love a good podcast. I'll listen like while I'm working during the day, if I'm just doing something like with an Excel file, or if I'm traveling, I'll listen to a few episodes, like I'll download them and listen while I'm on the plane. Anyways, I've got a few that I've been listening to all about cults. Let me tell you about these and even some of my favorite episodes. This first one is called Sounds Like a Cult, and one of the hosts is actually Amanda Montell, the author of Cultish. So their approach is a little bit different in that they're not looking at like actual cults. They've got things like the Cult of the Boy Scouts was one that just came out, or my two favorite were the Cult of True Crime and the Cult of Trader Joe's, where they talk about just like culty things. So what kind of language, or the people who follow true crime, the people who really are diehard Trader Joe's fans, like what behaviors are sort of similar to what you would see in a cult member. But like obviously no one is saying Trader Joe's is a cult. It's very fascinating. It's really engaging podcast. They're not annoying. I feel like a lot of podcast hosts are very annoying. It's really enjoyable. I would recommend it. Then we've got the podcast Trust Me, and this also has two female hosts, and one of them, I think she actually grew up in a cult. They make references to it in different episodes, but I haven't been able to find an episode where they talk about her backstory. There were two episodes I listened to recently that I particularly enjoyed. There was actually a 2-part series, and this was called Life After Westboro, where they interviewed a woman named Lauren Drain. This is so interesting. Her dad was a documentary filmmaker, and when she was a teenager, he went to Kansas to try to interview and do a documentary about the Westboro Baptist Church, which is a hate group. They're the ones who will picket at funerals and say like God hates, a slur word. Very, very hateful. And so her dad got sucked into it. And so he went down there to make a documentary about them. And then her family, next thing she knows, were members of the cult. So they did 2 episodes, sort of how her family got into it, living in that cult, and then escaping in her life after the cult. She actually has a book. I forget the name of her book, but her name's Lauren Drain. She went on to be a nurse, a fitness model. She's really like made a life for herself outside the group, and I think her family has since left the cult. The other episode I really enjoyed, there was a Conspiracy Month series that they did at one point on the Trust Me podcast, and they did one with a man named Pablo Vergara. And if you remember the Elisa Lam case, if you're into true crime, there was a Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles, and this woman was found dead in their water tower. And when they looked at the security footage, there was just all kinds of weird stuff. Like she was trying to get on and off an elevator, and it looked like maybe someone was chasing her, and that's what she was scared of, but you never saw anyone else in the footage. Somehow, this guy who is a Mexican rock star, like people online, like an online mob went after him and thought that he was the one who did it, and were trying to like make up stories how he was connected to it. And he's like, I wasn't even in the country at the time. And so he really goes into how his life was turned upside down because these people who are so into true crime and so into conspiracies, which is kind of culty in itself, destroyed his life. It was a very, very interesting episode. Another one I've been listening to lately is called Was I in a Cult? They haven't had any new episodes since like September of 2022, but it is interesting. People can call in and share their stories of a situation they went through, and then they kind of talk about like, was it a cult? Was it just sort of like a really shitty situation? Like where in that continuum did it fall? But again, no new episodes lately. And so we just talked about that book Broken Faith, about the Word of Faith Fellowship. There is a podcast that goes into this, dives deep just into this Jane Whaley character and her cult. So the Pretend podcast, specifically season 3, he is able to interview people who left the cult. He's able to go and join the church service at the cult itself and even interview Jane Whaley. It's wild. I think there's like 9 episodes. So yeah, Pretend season 3, if you're interested in knowing more about the Word of Faith Fellowship and hearing from Jane herself. It's very interesting. Like there's actual audio from the interviews that he includes in the episodes. All right, this next one, this is a new one I just came across and I haven't listened to it yet. This is called The Sunshine Place. And this is about the Synanon cult, which was in California, or is still in California, and started off as sort of like a detox program and then became into like a weird new age religion and then became a full-on cult. That's the one that Amanda Montell, the author of Cultish, her father grew up in the Synanon cult. And again, I haven't listened to that podcast, so if someone listens and it's good, please let me know. And then the last recommendation I have, somewhat adjacent to cult, this is called Life After MLM. And this was started by Roberta Blevins, and she was actually in LuLaRoe. If you've seen that LuLaRich docuseries, I think on Amazon Prime, she was in one of the major people they interviewed for that. So she went on and started her own podcast to talk about people who fallen victims to MLM schemes. So things like pyramid schemes. That's a very interesting one to listen to as well, but more like cult adjacent than like an outright cult. Okay, lastly, let's move on to like docuseries and documentaries that you can find on a variety of streaming platforms. So I pay for the HBO Max subscription. I just go into my Amazon Prime app and it all loads into there. So I'm going to let you know if it's part of HBO or if it's part of Amazon or whatnot. But if you don't already have the HBO subscription, it might be worth it, or at least doing the free trial. So Heaven's Gate is what it sounds like. It's about that Heaven's Gate cult where they thought that like a UFO was going to come and beam them up and take them to the next life. I don't know. So really sadly, that's where like the house full of people were found after a mass suicide, and they all were in matching tracksuits and the Nike shoes. Anyways, this series goes into the beginnings of it and how these 2 people were able to get people to believe this crazy thing that UFOs were going to come beam them up. I don't know, but it's very interesting. I've watched the first 2 episodes so far. All right, and then LuLaRich, this is just part of Amazon Prime. It's not an extra fee that you pay, and this is about the downfall of the LuLaRoe, like the leggings pyramid scheme company. It's again, maybe a stretch to say it's an outright cult, but there is a lot of overlap. Like if you look at a Venn diagram of MLMs and cults, there is a lot of overlap there in the middle. And it was just really interesting and enjoyable few episode docuseries about how people got sucked into this, how they thought they were going to make all this money off of leggings, how some people did actually make a lot of money, and then how the company was just mismanaged and people were getting really bad product, moldy product. Meanwhile, the owners are like living the high life and going on cruises and designer bags. And anyways, it's very, very interesting. Okay, then we've got The Vow. This is also on HBO Max, so you would have to pay for the extra subscription. But this is about Nixium. So this is that Keith Rainier cult, and it even had, what's that chick from Smallville or whatever? Like a C-list actress. Anyways, they were able to trick women to join this group, and they thought it was going to be like female empowerment type of a group, and like training, like personal improvement, self-improvement type training. And then they find themselves that they're in this like sex cult, and they were getting branded. Like, it was just freaking crazy. Anyways, he's behind bars now. But The Vow, that's about the NXIVM cult. Fun fact, I'm originally from New York State. And this is after I moved away, but in middle school, high school, like I grew up living in this townhouse development. And when the news broke that Keith Raniere of this NXIVM group had been arrested, I read about it first on my local news from where I'm from, up in New York State, because I still read it from time to time. My family's up there, and it said the street that where their little house was and the name of the development, and it was my freaking development I lived in. They were down the street from where I grew up, so there was no overlap. I don't know what the point of this is. I wasn't living there at the same time they were there, but it was just interesting because I'm like, oh yeah, I know that house that was down the street. Like, I think my bus stop was like 2 houses down from that house when I was in high school. So that's about NXIVM. Next, we've got, there's two. If you want to learn about the Waco siege and the Branch Davidians, David Koresh, I've watched both of these. They're both pretty good. And they are both on Prime. I don't think you need to pay the extra for HBO. One is called Waco, The Rules of Engagement. And this was filmed in the 90s, and it actually interviewed people who were part of the FBI siege. It went terribly wrong, and the FBI has changed their tactics because of that scenario. And I talk about what went wrong, how it failed. And then there's this newer one called Waco, The Longest Siege, which was, I think, in 2015. And similar, they're still talking about what went wrong, but it's like now there's more years distant between the event and today, and they can talk about like what the FBI would have done today, how law enforcement would have handled it today. All right, next up, we've got Jonestown, Paradise Lost. This is on Prime. You don't need to pay extra. This is about Jim Jones, the People's Temple, and how he brought people down to Guyana, and they were living on that compound, and everyone knows that like drink the Kool-Aid slogan, or saying rather, and how people were forced to commit suicide with cyanide laced. It was actually Flavor Aid. It wasn't Kool-Aid. It was the brand name Flavor Aid. That one is very interesting, but if you already know like those high points about that cult, like I don't think it really shares too much extra information. I think a lot of people just know about that one from it being talked about in popular culture. And then the last, I haven't seen this yet and I really want to. This is through HBO, and this is called Q, Into the Storm. And it's about this QAnon and these QAnon crazy folks and how they believe stuff from this guy named Q on the internet, and he's telling them that there's like an international cabal killing children and drinking their blood. I mean, these people are something else. And I got to be careful because I know there are QAnon people in my town. There have been actual rallies, and they've been in front of the courthouse, and like the cops don't do anything because my personal belief is that they're part of it. Yeah, I feel like if I say much more, I'm going to get taken out. So I want to watch that. Okay, and then a few more things on Netflix. I have watched all of these. There's Wild Wild Country, and this is about a cult that started over in India, and then they bought some land out in Oregon, and then they moved all the people out there. They all created new names for themselves, and they were all like one family, and they followed this Osho guy who was supposed to be their spiritual leader. And anyways, I won't spill the beans. It's downhill from there. Next, we've got Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. This one, okay, you have to be really careful watching this, especially if you've got any sort of triggers, or if you've gone through sexual abuse yourself. I would just caution you. I've none of that, and it was very difficult to listen. So this is about Warren Jeffs and the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints cult, the polygamous cult, like out in the Western United States. And it just chronicles the abuse of women and children. I mean, there's no easy way to say it. Sexual abuse, rampant sexual abuse, and how when his father died and Warren Jeffs took over as the new prophet, how he just used this to his advantage. And this is what's so hard. There are tape recordings, and you can hear the tape recordings of crimes that were committed. And these You can't even say women because they were children when it happened. It's very, very disturbing. He's now in jail. So it does go over how he was caught, apprehended, charged, convicted. So he is in jail, hopefully, I think, for the rest of his life. Okay, and then on Hulu, we've got a few good options. There actually is a series where each episode is about a different cult, and this is called Cults and Extreme Beliefs. So there is an episode on Nixium, on the Children of God. There's one on 12 Tribes, or the 12th Tribe, whatever that one's called. So each episode is about a new cult. Very, very interesting. And there's also something called Stolen Youth. This just came out, I think, in the last few weeks. And this is about that Sarah Lawrence, that college group that was taken in by this guy, Larry Ray, where he moved into their house, college campus with them. I can't understand how a college campus let this go. I was a RA, resident advisor, where you're like in charge of your little dorm. I just can't imagine being like, oh yeah, it's totally normal that this 50-year-old dude moved into my residence dorm room. Like, it's just so weird. Anyways, that's on Hulu. Just came out recently. I haven't watched it yet, but sounds very interesting. And that the Sloanham Woods 9 book, that's about the same group. Woo, that was a lot. Hopefully, no matter what type of media you enjoy consuming, if it's reading, podcasts, or watching something on streaming, hopefully you found something new for you to go and enjoy and learn about. This is like just one of my favorite topics to discuss. Like, I'm definitely a true crime fan, but even more so, like, if it has to do with cults, ooh, I am there. I find it so fascinating, especially when you look at cults all over the world. It could be a totally different language, a totally different culture and religion, but the tactics are the same. The type of language that they use, the type of deception techniques, it's just so amazing to me that, like, worldwide, across the entire human experience, when it comes to cults, the same things hold true no matter where the cult is in the world. Just, I don't know. Something about that is just really fascinating to me. Okay, I've been rambling for like, I don't even know what, an hour. I don't know how long this video is gonna be when it comes up, but I've been rambling all day. So anyways, that's all I have for you today. If you haven't watched part 1, please go back. I would encourage you to go back and catch that, where we talk about the basics of cults, how they function, who joins them, and why. And let me know down below if you have read or listened or watched any of these suggestions I gave you today. That's all I have. I will touch base with you guys in my next video soon. Bye, guys.